Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me and can see me. I think I
Yes. Hello.
right. Yes. Um, well, welcome to the second module of the Psychology of Wellbeing course. Today, we're going to be focusing on talking about research dealing with objective reality and its effects on well-being. There's so many topics that we'll need to cover. So if you have any questions, just jot those questions in the chat room, and see. We'll have a break, probably closer to 11, and maybe we'll be able to answer some of those questions before we move on and finish that module, and then we'll continue with the second module next time. So next week we'll also, because again, there's so many topics to discuss. But again, don't hesitate. If you have any questions, just go ahead and jot those questions in the chat room. And I'll see if I'll be able to get to them. I'm sure if you have any questions, probably other people will, are likely to have the same questions. So again, don't hesitate. Do you see my slide? Am I sharing my slide? Anyone would say? Yeah, you can see it. Okay,
Yeah,
great. So again, we're going to be continuing with, this is how the book is divided, and we're going to be, again, talking about, in essence, this is what we can be focusing on, the objective reality and its effect on happiness. And we're focusing on the topics in chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we're dealing with 4 different chapters. So the gist of our discussion is we're going to examine the research in quality of life and well-being in relation to the effects of technology, the effects of economics, the effects of political systems, sociocultural factors, resources in terms of money, time, money, income, wealth, demographics in terms of age, sex, marital status, education, and the like, and then personal consumption activities. And ultimately, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what we call the natural sciences, dealing with biology and from genes and hormones and the like, all the way to drugs and life events and the physical environment. So again, so many topics, so much research, and they're all pretty exciting. So I'm excited to tell you about, that kind of research. We'll start out with technology. So again, what we're doing is we're examining the research dealing with the effects of technology. And in this specific instance, it would be media technology. We're not dealing with any kind of technology. Again, media technology is the focus of this discussion. So the idea is that the use of media technology impacts well-being. And so what is the research telling us about this? It tells us that, yes, the use of media technology. So what do we mean by media technology? We're talking about things like, whatever we're doing. Actually, Zoom is part of media technology. That's exactly what we're doing, right? Use of Facebook, Instagram, email, video games, using the internet on, for example, doing a Google search. All of this is media technology. And of course, in modern society, we can't function without media technology. But so again, the research has focuses what are the beneficial effects of media technology on well-being, and also what would be the detrimental effects, the adverse effects of the use of media technology on well-being. Well, let's look at it. So again, we're going to be focusing on those mediating factors, complementary processes, as well as what we call interference processes. Interference processes are the ones that create it takes away, detract from well-being, and complementary processes are the ones that contribute to well-being. So positive effects versus negative effects. Well, let's look at those a little bit more closely. Let's look at the complementary effects. The complementary processes, in essence, contributing to well-being, and again, the interference effects contributing to ill-being. So what are those complementary processes? Providing opportunities for positive emotional experiences. Way we use media technology, let's say, for example, every time, for example, we communicate by text, or we look at something in Facebook, because of our connectedness with other people, it's very likely that, again, this type of connection or this kind of communication is likely to contribute to positive experiences. And therefore, those positive experiences translate in terms of positive affect, ultimately well-being. Positive affect is, of course, as part of life satisfaction, or at least it contributes to life satisfaction and subjective well-being at large. Let me give you an example. I have 4 daughters, and they're all adults, and I have grandkids, grandchildren, a bunch of them actually, and I stay connected with them. I don't think there is a day or possibly several hours in which I don't get some sort of communication from one or several of my daughters and my grandkids. And I feel pretty positive staying connected with them through, again, text messages, Facebooks, and the like, email too. Sometimes we do FaceTime using the iPhone. So again, these are positive experiences that are undoubtedly contribute to at least my well-being, right? And there's quite a bit of research that, again, demonstrate this positive effect. It contributes to well-being. Satisfying basic psychological needs. That's the second bullet. What do we mean by psychological needs? Usually in psychology, or at least in the psychology of well-being, the reference to basic psychological needs tend to relate to 3 different types of needs. One is relatedness, meaning that we connect with other people and we have a need for what you call relatedness, to connect with other people and establish positive relationships. And the second one is the need for competence. So one needs to feel competent, feel master, to essentially control one's destiny, to control one's environment. And this is a very important need and very basic psychological need. And the third one is the need for autonomy. We need to feel autonomous, that we can control our own destiny. And make our own decisions rather than have other people make those decisions for us. So a certain amount of independence and autonomy is really a very basic psychological needs. And again, the contention, the supposition is that the use of media technology does indeed satisfy the psychological needs, basic psychological needs. The need for competence, the need for autonomy, and the need for relatedness. And just the example I just shared with you about, again, my connecting with my own children and grandchildren is something that, again, satisfy my own need for relatedness, social connection, social relationships, and the like. Aiding efficient problem solving and supporting goal pursuit. And that seems to also seems to be obvious in the sense that, let's say, efficient problem solving. I am out there using GPS. Okay, well, GPS navigating, using this navigational system while I'm driving. That is the use of, again, media technology. And it helps me essentially solve the problem, meaning, I'm trying to essentially get to someplace, solve a problem. You can construe that as, in essence, a problem. And the GPS is helping me do that. Or maybe something like you do a Google search. Google search is helping to solve a specific problem. But not only solving a specific problem, but the use of media technology can also help you, pursue certain life goals. Let's say, for example, what we're doing here is definitely an educational goal, and it is an important life goal, for you and for me too, right? And therefore, again, using Zoom, for example, is a good example of how, again, media technology helps you pursue life goals. In this case, it would be an educational goal. Let's talk about the adverse effects of the use of media technology, and what does the research demonstrate? And the research sort of has focused in terms of what we call attention cost and substitution. Attention cost is divided in terms of at least two factors. One is taxing concurrent attentional resources. Let me repeat that. Taxing concurrent, meaning while you're at it, attentional resources. Let me give you an example in terms of what's happening with me and the way that I use media technology. I do a lot of writings. I write books and articles and so forth, right? That's my passion. And while I'm writing, doing my thing, really being totally embroiled in what you might call a train of thought, writing away, I get a text from one of my daughters, right? Okay, well, if I don't respond immediately, again, my daughter, they get upset. They worry about it. She says, why aren't you responding, right? And the expectation is that media technology allows you to respond immediately. And again, on the part of the sender, if the sender doesn't get an immediate response, they worry about something is happening to the recipient, so to speak, right? Me as being the recipient. So while I'm writing, right, trying to attend to those texts that are sent from my granddaughters or any of my daughters is taxing. It takes away from the attention that I am devoting, to writing whatever I'm writing, right? So it is, in essence, it takes away, it taxes on my concurrent attentional resources devoted to, again, my writing, whatever. Obviously, right? So that is a detrimental effect on well-being. It takes away from, when I do this, when it takes away from my train of thought, I end up making mistakes. I end up, losing that train of thought. And therefore it is taxing in the sense that it interferes with my goal pursuit of writing, or at least writing effectively, and again with trying to concentrate on what I'm doing. Compromising future attentional capacity. This is another factor that has an adverse effect on well-being. And the research indicates that, yes, it does, especially for children. Let's say when children spend so much on video games, for example, or texting their friends, they go into the classroom, for example, and their attentional span now is so short. They don't have much of an attention span. So because the structure of media technology, let's say, whatever they're doing, whether let's say texting or looking at Facebook, or, again, has a very small attention span. Now, going into the classroom requires a much longer attention span. So when children becomes used to so much of the media technology, it's sort of, it takes an adverse effects on future attentional capacities. They do not now have the attentional capacity to, sit quietly and listen to the teacher. Listen to the teacher for probably a whole hour in the classroom. That is an adverse effect. And it takes away from well-being in the sense that, again, not doing well in the classroom because you're not paying attention, because your attentional capacity has been diminished by the frequent use of media technology. Again, that takes a toll on your grade performance, for example, not doing well in the classroom, and ultimately that translates into a well-being decrement. Then we have substitution. Substitution comes in two forms. Again, replacement of concurrent activities and displacement of subsequent activities. So the idea of replacement of concurrent activities is when the use of media technology becomes a substitute to other much more healthy types of interaction. So when a child, for example, uses so much texting instead of right, interacting with friends face to face is much more conducive to generating well-being, positive affect, rather than, again, doing it by text. So when you're doing so much using media technology, it takes away from those good opportunities to interact with people face to face, which in essence generates a higher level of well-being. That's what we call substitution. So in essence, there's what you might call an opportunity cost, but we'll talk about opportunity cost also as a moderator. Displacement of subsequent activities. So what does that mean? The use of media technology displaces, it displaces, not only it substitutes, but it does away with a certain kind of activity that is essential to good functioning and ultimately well-being. Take, for example, children, they use so much texting and they browse, let's say maybe TikTok at night before bedtime. Are you familiar with TikTok? Right. Yeah. So they spend so much time right before bedtime, texting and browsing on TikTok that they lose sleep. Right? They end up sleep deprived. They wake up like zombies in the morning because they spend so much time on TikTok and texting to their friends. So that is an activity that has been displaced, right? Sleeping is displaced by the frequent and chronic use of media technology. That definitely has an adverse effect on well-being. And again, the research indicates that much. Now, these mediating effects in terms of interference and complementary processes are moderated, meaning they are either amplified or diminished. That's what we call moderated, right? So there are moderator variables in the effect of those complementary processes as well as interference processes on well-being. And the research point to at least three important variables: involvement, relevant to activities, and opportunity cost. Now, involvement is pretty obvious. Let's say if you're using Facebook, you can really become involved in the use of Facebook. Let's say you become a very active participant. And by being active, that means you're highly emotionally involved with the use of Facebook. And if you do this, you possibly are on Facebook and you're sharing, right? You're actively involved in Facebook by sharing a whole bunch of, you upload a whole bunch of things, from photos to a whole bunch of other things, articles or what have you, right? So you are an active participant. An active participant is in essence a person that is highly involved. And of course, if a person is maybe a subscriber of Facebook, but once in a while only looks at it, that's a passive participant. That person is not actively involved in that. So if a person is actively involved, meaning it experiences a high level of emotional involvement with the media technology, any kind of complementary process or interference process is likely to be amplified. So whatever effect that you see from a complementary process or an interference process on well-being, again, it's likely to be amplified as a function of the extent to which the person is involved with that media technology. So that person is very involved, meaning an active participant, then any kind of a complementary or interference process, again, it becomes amplified on well-being. Well, the same thing is very much related to the second moderating factor, which is relevance to activities. Let's say relevance is, let's say if you're using text messaging for the purpose of connecting with people and ultimately establishing positive relationships with people, then the relevance of this activity is pretty high on social well-being. And therefore, your texting, your use of text messaging is likely to enhance social well-being. And social well-being is part of course, overall well-being. Therefore, the relevance of this activity moderates the effect of the use of text messaging on well-being. On the other hand, if you're using text messaging for a very different purpose, well, I'd say, for example, you're expressing envy, you're expressing disgust, you're expressing anger. Well, that's the kind of thing that is not relevant to positive emotions related to social well-being. And therefore, again, that would take away from well-being. Opportunity costs. We conduct our daily lives in such a way that things are essential. We have to wake up and we have to make up our beds. We have to eat breakfast. We have to groom ourselves. We have to take a shower, essentially for hygiene purposes. There are so many essential things that we do in order to enhance our daily functioning. When we become so embroiled with the use of media technology, and the use of media technology takes away from those opportunities that would help us, again, conduct ourselves in the most effective way possible, meaning function effectively on a daily basis, then that is a cost. So the use of the media technology, again, takes away from those opportunities that are essential for daily function. And therefore, again, those opportunities, if they are available, and again, that factor becomes a moderating factor, because in some people, there may be no opportunities out there, and therefore, again, the interference would be minimal. So it varies from one individual to another, and therefore that becomes a moderator per se. Although we talked about it in the context of interference as in terms of substitution, media, the use of media technology substitutes, other essential tasks of daily functioning. Okay, we're ready to move on. If you have any questions, it'll be a good time to, jot down your question in the chat room so that we can follow up. By the way, if you're interested in this particular topic, this whole discussion and this whole model of complementary processes and interference processes as mediating and then the moderating conditions, they're all fleshed out in this article by Kushlev, Media Technology and Wellbeing, Complementary and Interference Model, in this handbook. By the way, this also handbook by Diener and his colleagues, which is called Handbook of Wellbeing, is a very rich source of research literature on well-being, especially subjective well-being. So again, if you're interested in that, I urge you to check out this particular article. And as a matter of fact, this is available on the internet, so you can easily get it by just do a Google search. Okay. No questions. Things are very clear. Well, that's music to my ears. Let's look at, again, other types of objective reality types of factors from, let's say, economics and economic factors. So we're looking at the environment, and usually economists and those people who are involved in well-being, we call them happiness economists. Happiness economists. As a matter of fact, that is now becoming a well-established field in economics, happiness economics. Well, from this kind of research that happiness economists conduct, we have a whole bunch of economic factors that have been associated with well-being through, again, good empirical studies. Economic fluctuations, market openness, income inequality, unemployment, inflation, welfare system, and membership in labor unions. Well, let's again take each factor at a time and try and understand the research behind it. Economic fluctuation, again, economic booms and busts. Does the economy, in terms of its fluctuation, the booms and busts, do these fluctuations affect individual well-being? And the answer is yes. There is evidence to suggest that these economic fluctuations do indeed affect individual well-being. Now, the research, when they focus on economic fluctuations, they tend to capture economic fluctuations using gross domestic product. So the GDP is a very common measure by economists in capturing what we talk in terms of, the busts, the booms and busts of economic fluctuations. And again, studies have shown that economic booms contribute to life satisfaction while busts detract from it. That is established by good evidence. Okay, let's move on to the second economic factor, and that is market openness. What do we mean by market openness? And how do economists, especially happiness economists, measure that? Market openness deals with the extent to which the market is open versus closed in terms of trade relations. So in the international business, international economics, international finance, international marketing, we usually talk about the extent to which a country is open to trade, right, versus closed. And usually the measure of openness to trade is captured by tariffs and non-tariffs barrier. Tariffs is nothing more than when a good is imported into a country, then it's taxed. There's a duty on it. A duty is levied on this imported product. So a country can literally erect all kinds of barriers to trade by levying duties, taxes, tariffs. That's what we call it. So let's say recently, actually, in the last few years, the United States has erected a barrier, a tariff barrier, to levy more tariffs on a whole bunch of products, actually during the Trump administration, because Trump, his whole political focus on America first, and therefore trying to erect those trade barriers to protect, American industry, right? And by doing so, erecting those barriers would allow those industries to prosper, and therefore, again, it becomes a hurdle. So the United States market became less open, more closed during the Trump administration, although these tariff barriers have been sort of undone by the incoming administration, the Biden administration. But nevertheless, the idea is that, again, tariffs and non-tariff barriers tend to be used by economists to capture the extent to which a market of a given country is open or closed, right? Any questions about that? So again, happiness economics economists, I mean, have shown through empirical evidence that countries with greater market openness have people reporting high life satisfaction than countries with less market openness. So market openness tends to be an economic factor that contributes to well-being. Interesting, isn't it? Income inequality. There's quite a bit of research on that. As a matter of fact, Pickett, who is one economist, have written a book that generated quite a buzz dealing with income inequality and the effect of income inequality on people's quality of life. So how do economists measure income inequality? Usually there is a very well-established index, which is called the Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient captures income disparity between and among individuals in society in a given country. So the higher the score, the higher level of inequality in the Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient goes from 0 all the way up to 1. So using Gini coefficient, it has been established by happiness economists that income equality is negatively related to life satisfaction. This is kind of interesting. Countries with lesser inequality have more people satisfied with life than countries with greater inequality. I guess if you can think in terms of some of the Nordic countries, for example, the Nordic countries as in Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, these are the Nordic countries, as well as the Netherlands. They have lesser income inequality. And the Nordic countries, it's amazing, they score very highly as nations, as countries, on life satisfaction. People living in Nordic countries report much higher levels of life satisfaction than in other countries. And one explanation is that in the Nordic countries, they're much more socialist. And by definition, not communist to the extent the extreme, but socialist in the sense that, again, income inequality is frowned upon. And there are so many policies, national policies that ensure, again, the reduction of income inequality in those countries. So again, happiness economists tend to point at the Nordic countries as an example of why you see this kind of effect. And yeah, I guess it makes sense. But the caveat is, oh, wait a minute, there are so many moderator factors, meaning qualifiers. It depends on this and it depends on that, right? Okay, so what are those moderators? As you can see in the slides, it depends on cultural values like materialism and individualism. In the United States, for example, the United States is, from a cultural value perspective, tend to be much more materialistic. People tend to be much more materialistic. And people also, because there's so much emphasis on freedom and independence, again, part of the cultural persona of the United States, as well as, of course, Canada too, because we usually talk about North America, is this business of individualism. People are highly individualistic. As a matter of fact, I mean, we as Americans, we raise our our children in such a way that, again, we enculturate in them the value of independence. And once they finish high school, then they are out on their own. Of course, if you have the means, you end up in college, and that would be sort of a rites of passage to independence, right? Independence. So we do whatever it takes in order to make our children independent. So it's part of the cultural aura, so to speak, cultural persona. Now, culturally speaking, because we so much emphasize individualism and materialism, meaning that sometimes we measure success in life in terms of achievement and wealth. Because we do so much of that, it is ingrained as a cultural value. Inequality, any kind of perception of inequality, for people in the United States or North America, becomes accentuated, becomes amplified, and it generates negative affect. A negative affect detracts from well-being. So again, people living in individualistic, materialistic countries, income inequality tends to take away from well-being, and therefore it creates a more prominent effect, a more prominent adverse effect on well-being than if you live in another country that is less individualistic, less materialistic. What would be a country like that? Well, we have a number of people from Thailand here, right? I would probably think that Thailand is less materialistic and less individualistic. You agree?
Yes.
There you go. Okay. So again, that is a moderator that has been well established in research. Social comparisons, that means when you compare your income and wealth with other people in your peer group, whatever that group is, reference group, as in terms of gender, or maybe in your region of residence, then those perceptions of income inequality becomes exacerbated meaning amplified in a bad way. It's kind of interesting, although sometimes I'm so much for the feminist movement, for example. I'm pretty liberal, and therefore this whole business of the gender disparity is something that I abhor. As a matter of fact, I'm constantly reminded by my wife. My wife is a psychologist, and she constantly reminds me of those disparities between men and women, and in many ways, this is sexist, and this and this is unfair, and again, talk about fairness between men and women. When people, let's say women in the United States, that tend to make those social comparisons between men and women, especially in terms of income. My colleague, who's a man, we're talking about from the perspective of a woman, my colleague who's a man is making much more money than I make, and literally our jobs are identical. That's a social comparison. Now, when you make that kind of social comparison, then ultimately this is what we call an upward comparison, meaning that you're down there and you're comparing yourself to a person who is doing better than you are. That's what you call an upward social comparison. You feel bad about your position, your situation. And therefore, that creates unhappiness, right? Ill-being. And when you make those kinds of comparisons, then again, that detracts from your well-being. So again, those people that make those comparisons tend to suffer ill-being, from ill-being, because of those social comparisons. That's why, again, a lot of people, especially in human resource management, they try and make salaries as essentially a private thing. And especially in private companies, you don't have data to allow you to know what your colleagues are making, so that you reduce those kind of social comparisons. And of course, but then by definition, it creates gender disparity, meaning that women are entitled to know what their colleagues are making, because if they know, and if their colleagues are making much more than they are, you again, in the context of identical jobs, then they can sue the company, they can take the company to court, right? So there is a legal means to create a remedy to, again, deal with these kinds of disparities. But then it takes a toll on well-being. Well, but on the other hand, you can argue that it generates more well-being than it detracts from well-being, because if you reduce this disparity between men and women, at least at work, then, and if women tend to achieve equality again with their counterparts, then that adds to women's well-being. So it's a double-edged sword. I mean. Now, this is another thing. Those who are ideologically liberal in their political views. This is interesting. So here we're saying is that those people who are liberal tend to engage in those social comparisons much more so than those who have conservative viewpoints. Think about it. Why is that? Those people who are liberal tend to focus on injustice. So when we talk about, for example, gender disparity between men and women, that is an issue of social injustice. And liberals tend to, regard these issues as very prominent, very important. As a matter of fact, any kind of social issue dealing with injustice is on the political agenda, so to speak, right? Liberals tend to, again, regard those issues as very important. And as a matter of fact, many of the national policies are very much relegated to this issue, to the prominence of what we call social injustice. And liberals, meaning those people who are leaning towards the left side of the political spectrum, tend to focus on those kinds of issues. And therefore, when they focus too much on those kinds of issues, especially income inequality, it becomes one of those issues, right? Again, that detracts from their well-being. So if all of us here, it's very likely that we're much more, left, a little bit towards on the left side of the political spectrum, then we think a lot more about those kinds of issues. And the more we think about those kinds of income inequality types of issues, the more we feel bad about ourselves, the more we feel dissatisfied about our lives if those income inequalities, again, become a major point in our thought processes. You don't want to hear that, did you? But that's the reality. Full-time employed individuals, for those under 40, those below average incomes in countries with less mobility. So all of these factors, they signal situations in which the person is down there and making upward social comparisons, right? So again, people are employed full-time, and if they are employed full-time and they are making less money than their counterparts, then they're likely to feel a sense of ill-being as a function of those social comparisons. Now, those people who work part-time, like for example, there are many traditional women who choose to become mothers and housewives, and they would only work part-time. The issue of income inequality is not prominent in their mindset, and therefore it doesn't generate ill-being as much as a person who is working full-time. See that? Well, the same thing with those people under 40, the younger people tend to, again, make less money than those people who are over 40. And therefore, if they would focus on income inequality, this situation becomes prominent in terms of what we call the upward social comparison, and that generates ill-being rather than well-being. Those below income, that average income, that goes by definition. But that's interesting. The last one, in countries with less mobility. What do we mean by mobility? In economics, mobility in a country is the extent to which you can climb the ladder. You can climb the income ladder easily, much more easily than in countries in which there's very little mobility. Take, for example, a communist country, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea. By definition, communism as a political regime frowns upon people who make more money than others. The whole idea of brotherhood and equality is so much emphasized in communist regimes than in countries that are much more capitalistic, right? The United States is probably considered to be much more capitalist than socialist, although we have so many policies to ensure a certain level of equality. Nevertheless, again, it's considered to be much more capitalist than socialist. So the idea is that in communist countries, there's very little social mobility. And if you can't climb the ladder because of the communist regime, for example, then you don't have much of a choice. You can't, engaging in this kind of social comparison is futile, is not going to do you any good, because focusing on income disparity is taboo, social taboo. You don't talk about that. You're not a good communist if you focus on income inequality, right? And therefore, again, in that context, in countries with less social mobility, this it becomes a moot point. People don't do that, and therefore it doesn't, it doesn't affect their well-being in an adverse way. But on the other hand, if you are in a country that allows social mobility, not only allows it, but encourage social and economic mobility, like in the United States, then you're very likely to make those kind of social comparisons. And if you make those kind of social comparisons, then you become fixated on income disparities, income inequalities. And if you focus on income equality, because there is social mobility, but you're not climbing up that ladder to the extent that you hope you should, again, that takes away from well-being. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Again, if you have any questions, I have a question from Malgorzata. Did I pronounce your name right? Yeah, how do you pronounce your name? Unmute yourself. Unmute. You're still muted. Oops, still can't hear you. Okay, well, so there's something wrong with your mic, or I don't know. Hopefully not the system. You can hear me, right? Okay. In the book, by the way, if you don't have the book, in the book, there's all kinds of references to that. So again, the book has plenty of reference to this, but why don't you communicate with me privately if you don't have the book, and I will send you a whole bunch of references. Okay. Oh, you do have the book. Okay, well, that's great. So it's in that chapter on income inequality. So read it, and there's plenty of reference in there. And if you want additional references, I'd be happy to share. Okay, so let's move on to talk about unemployment. Excuse me. Oh, it's 11 o'clock. Should we take a 10-minute break? Let's do that. 10-minute break. Okay, can we reassemble? Reconvene. Wonderful. Okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about is unemployment. And again, happiness economists have really provided so much evidence that unemployment does affect well-being in a very strong way, actually. But there are a whole lot of qualifiers, meaning moderators. So the idea is, well, how do you measure unemployment? Unemployment is measured by economists as sort of the country level as unemployment rate. And of course, that can be divided in terms of region. So different regions within the country has its own different unemployment rates. But anyway, this is a very well-established metric. And the findings suggest that unemployment is negatively related to life satisfaction. Countries with lower unemployment rates have more people satisfied with their life than countries with higher unemployment. A very well-established finding. But again, It depends. It depends on a whole bunch of other things, right? So it depends on what? Gender. Now that's interesting. So the research shows that um, unemployment hurts, from the perspective of well-being, hurts men much more than women. Why? The reason being is that, at least culturally speaking, that men tend to be socialized in many cultures, many countries, thinking, believing that their job is the most important part of their identity. When it comes to women, although women have joined the labor force en masse, there is still this belief, culturally speaking, that when it comes to women, a job, a career, is only part of her identity, not the totality of her identity. So being a mother, being a wife, being all of these other roles, caretaker, a nurturant individual, taking care of one's family, one's community, is definitely much prominent in the minds of women than men. Men tend to focus on their own careers, their own jobs, and therefore once they become unemployed, it really affects their identity. They experience what you might call an identity crisis. And that really affects their well-being in a much more detrimental fashion than women. So there's definitely a gender effect. Now, of course, one can argue that, this used to be the case much more so in the past than the present. And yes, we can see a trend because, again, women tend to have joined the labor force much more forcefully. And the whole idea of gender disparity, gender equality has been remedied in at least in many countries, especially in Europe and in North America, as well as a whole bunch of other countries in Asia too. So again, it's not, the moderating effect of gender is not as pronounced as it once used to be. So we can say that comfortably. Age, more middle-aged than young and old, or middle-aged than young and old. And the reason being is because, the middle-aged are the ones that are most affected by unemployment, obviously. So the effect becomes much more pronounced for the, people in the middle age than the ones that are young and the ones that are old. Education, those who are more than less educated. Now imagine a person who is highly educated and is jobless. Well, that person has invested so much of himself or herself, right, in terms of developing a career, and then he or she finds themselves to be unemployed. Well, that's much more devastating than a person who is less educated, right? That person hasn't invested much time, effort, and money, right, in their education compared to those people who did so. So the unemployment effect becomes much more pronounced for those who are highly educated than those who are not. That's a moderating effect. Time of unemployment those who are chronically unemployed. Okay, we face the realistic fact that in any country, because of the economy, economy goes boom and bust. And then when you have a recession, you end up with unemployment, you end up with furlough. So we accept that. And therefore, when you have a situation like that, the unemployment doesn't really affect the individual's well-being as much as if that person remains unemployed. So chronic unemployment over time. So even when the economy does good and that person still finds himself or herself unemployed, that really takes a toll on well-being, much more so than what we call temporary unemployment. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? Political leanings, those with right-wing ideology. That's kind of an interesting thought. Those people who have right-wing ideology in terms of political leaning, tend to be much more adversely affected by unemployment, those people on the liberal, or what you might call the leftist side of the political spectrum. Why is that? My hunch is that there is another kind of thing going on. Those people who are a little bit more to the right are much more conservative. And therefore, if they are much more conservative, and if they're especially men, right, then, the whole idea of jobs and career becomes so all-encompassing in terms of the totality of their identity. And then if they become unemployed, it affects them a lot more than those who are to the left of the political spectrum. Does that make sense? Hope so. Level of economic development of the country. For those who are poor countries, let's say, countries maybe in the heart of Africa, as in maybe Rwanda. Here you have a poor country, and not only poor, but has been ravaged by war. Unemployment doesn't really affect well-being as much. And the reason being is because, there's a whole bunch of other people who are unemployed. So the reference group, people compare themselves to, those people who are also poor and unemployed. Well, if you share that experience with so many others, that effect becomes diluted. The negative effect of unemployment becomes diluted. On the other hand, if you're in a rich country and the unemployment rate of the country is very small, then you don't have too many people to share that experience with, and therefore that effect, that negative effect of unemployment on well-being becomes much more pronounced. Make sense? Okay, no questions, right? I'm looking at the chat box. And we have a comment by Susan Schuster. She's directing that comment to all of you, so it'd be nice if you guys respond. Thank you, Susan, for making that comment. Okay, let's move on. Oh, we got 5 minutes. Inflation. Usually inflation, economists, they capture inflation using something like the consumer price index. For those few who are not familiar with the consumer price index, it is an index. It's a composite index that looks at price fluctuation price increases or decreases of a fixed basket of goods and services, right? So you measure the extent to which the cost of living goes up or down as a function of the price increases or decreases of this basket of goods and services. So the evidence suggests that inflation has a negative effect on subjective well-being in certain places in Europe, Latin America, and the US. We don't have evidence worldwide in terms of every country. And so again, the evidence is limited to those countries or those what you might call world regions. So there is some such suggestive evidence to say that, you know, inflation may have a negative effect on well-being. Welfare. Now welfare, you can actually analyze the effect of welfare from a macro perspective as well as a micro perspective. So from a macro perspective, do people living in welfare states experience more well-being than those people who are non-welfare states? Now, if you're in a country that has a welfare system, welfare, in essence, provides financial security. But in many instances, welfare is also part of the public health insurance system. So in many countries, you know, whether you are, for example, in the UK or Canada, in the United States, we don't have that. And essentially, we have a private healthcare system. So health insurance is essentially privately held, and it is controlled by employers and insurance companies and so forth. And, you know, at least in the United States, we try to deal with that with what we call some sort of a public version of health insurance, and we called it Obamacare because, again, President Obama is the one who essentially instituted that one. I mean, the public form of health insurance. So this is part of what you call the welfare system. So the evidence suggests that the evidence is weak, it's not strong, as you can see in this slide, suggesting that people in high welfare states report higher levels of life satisfaction compared to people in lower welfare states. And yes, if you look at, for example, the Nordic countries, you know, they have a very prominent, very well-established welfare system, from health insurance and other types of programs that provides what you call financial security. And yes, that becomes a buffer to ill-being. So it decreases well-being, ill-being, not necessarily increases well-being. So it serves as what you call a buffer that would prevent you from experiencing severe levels of ill-being. At the micro perspective, do welfare recipients experience increased well-being? Now this is what you call a double-edged sword, meaning yes, it contributes to well-being, but also it detracts from well-being too. How does that come about? So the evidence suggests that enrollment in the welfare system, so you become a welfare recipient, it provides poor people with a sense of financial security, thus increasing their sense of well-being. Okay, but on the other hand, again, those people on the welfare as welfare recipients become socially ostracized, stigmatized by society because they are welfare recipients. So that stigmatization, again, takes a toll on their well-being, meaning it generates ill-being. So you end up with Yes, it helps them with financial security that contributes to well-being, but on the other hand, it ostracizes them, it stigmatizes them, generating ill-being. So it's a double-edged sword from that perspective. Okay. Do we have any questions? I guess Susan's comment was the last one. Any more questions? No more questions, right? So we're going to leave it at that. I think this is the last. Oh, labor union. Okay, we'll talk about labor union. And then we're going to get into political factors from democratic governments and so forth, all the way to the effects of war, as we're seeing right now, and as things unfold in the Ukraine. It's so unfortunate. It's just so unfortunate, so sad that we witness such a catastrophic event. But anyway, we'll start picking up where we left off next time and finish the second module. Okay? Have a good rest of the day, a good rest of the evening. Or
Thank you.
okay. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.